Have you ever heard of a last will and testament? What do you think happens when you encounter this here in the Philippines? Attorney Erwin, what is the first thing that comes to mind when we think of wills here in the Philippines?
Well, let me guess. Parang pelikula kasi yan.
Okay,
so,
okay. Sige.
Mayaman na pamilya.
Yun.
May malaking sala.
Malaking sala. Okay.
Pero medyo madilim.
Madilim.
Kasi may namatay. So, malungkot.
Malungkot yung lighting natin. Okay?
Tapos sa background, marami nakaupo. Yung mga magkakapatid.
Oh, nandun sila. Meron silang, nasa sala na sila lahat.
Anong suot at oras naman?
Malamang itim yan. Nakaitim sila. May net pa.
Oo. Kasi nagluluksa.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
And bubukas yung pinto.
Yun.
Darating na si Atty. Yeah, naka-Amerikana yan.
Siyempre,
Oo.
naitim. Naitim din.
Si Atty. may dalang attache case.
No, malaking attache case.
Tapos rinig na rinig mo yung sapatos.
Yeah.
Tok. Tapos pupunta sa lamesa sa gitna. Bubuksan yung attache case. And then ilalabas yung last will and testament.
Yan.
Tapos lahat sila
magugulat sila.
kinakabahan habang binabasa isa-isa. So, Atty. Ramon, is it really like that dito sa Pilipinas? Nagawa mo na ba yan? Ikaw yung abogadong nakasuit sa gitna.
We will answer that today, okay? So, yan exactly ang question, or kind of like that, ang question ni Emily, who asks, Attorney, please advise us. My father died 6 months ago due to COVID. Nako. So we found a handwritten will among his things. The will says that it leaves 2 of his properties to my mom, to me, and my siblings. Can we submit my dad's will to the property registration office so that they can transfer the titles to us? Our relatives say it should be submitted to court. Is that true? Please help clarify our next steps. Yan.
If you are in a similar situation as Emily, stay tuned as we answer her question.
This video is brought to you by the Estate Settlement Guide, the fastest way to orient surviving family members when a loved one passes away. You will learn the basics of succession to know who can inherit and how much. It will guide you through the next steps your family needs to take so you don't incur penalties and you transfer the property to the heirs properly. Protect your family legacy. Avoid unnecessary penalties. Go to info.legalguide.ph/estate to learn more.
Welcome to Legal Guide Philippines, where we simplify the law to help you make better choices. I'm Attorney Erwin and I'm with my partner,
Attorney Ramon Ramirez.
So today, we're talking about estate settlement. Particularly, we're talking about what Emily should do next. So they found a will, but they don't know what to do with it. So how can we help Emily, Attorney Ramon?
Sure, great. So before we go into our discussion today, I think it's very important for us to discuss first some of the basics, okay? Because we're talking about estate settlement today. These basics are especially for those who are watching us for the first time. Attorney Erwin,
Para makasunod.
Yes, okay. Now, the first question is, what is an estate? So basically, an estate is all of the property, rights, and obligations left behind by a person who died. Okay, so to be clear, hindi lang siya property, but also includes rights and obligations as well. Lahat. Okay? Na iniwan ng taong namatay, who we call the
Decedent.
Decedent. Yan. Remember that term, decedent. That's what we call the person who died. Now, if that is the estate, what is estate settlement naman? Now, estate settlement is a process of putting in order the estate. Kaya nga settlement, no? And how do you do that? First, you do that by determining and collating all of his or her properties, rights, and obligations. Yan. And then, once na-collate lahat yan or na-collect lahat yan, we make sure that all the debts are paid. All the debts of the estate. Okay? And all the obligations are fulfilled. And then, after that, that's when we distribute everything to those who will inherit. Like, let's say, the heirs, or sometimes the devisees and legatees as well, or legatees, whatever the pronunciation is.
Mahaba palang proseso yan.
That's why we broke it down into 3, no? So, collecting everything, paying, and then distributing.
Okay.
All right. And now that we know what estate settlement is, what is a will? Because we're talking about a will today.
Ito yung nahanap ni Emily.
Yes. Okay. So, to know what a will is, we go to the Civil Code definition.
Okay.
Yan na.
Naku, kung may definition, kailangan natin, attorney, basa.
Attorney basa. Okay. According to the Civil Code, A will is an act whereby a person is permitted with the formalities prescribed by law to control to a certain degree the disposition of his estate to take effect after his death.
Galing talaga ni Atty.
Okay,
Basa.
very
Yeah.
clear, no? So, so basically, it is a document, no? Or it's an act which is done through a document wherein a person who is able to dispose of his estate when he dies, no? And but it has to be done within the bounds or formalities prescribed by law.
Yes.
Okay, very clear. So in this case, di ba ano tawag natin dun sa person who died?
Starts with the D.
Decedent.
Yeah.
All right. Now in this case, if there is a will involved, we can now call the decedent the testator.
Ayun,
Okay,
diba?
remember that also. So, when you hear the word testator, automatically you should think, okay, there's a will involved.
Kasi may iniwan siya testament.
Yes,
Yan.
ayan. Okay, very good. Now, there are two kinds of wills in the Philippines that we use here in the Philippines. We have the notarial will and the holographic will.
Sounds complicated.
Sounds
Atty.
complicated
Erwin,
ba?
oo.
Okay, so just very basic, very basic. So these two kinds of wills are both valid wills that can be used in the Philippines. The first one, notarial will, from the name, no, it has to be notarized.
Mhm.
But aside from being notarized, there are a lot of formal requirements for a notarial will. No? So it has to be signed by witnesses, di ba? And notarized and all that. No? And on the other hand, we have the holographic will. Okay, so a holographic will naman is entirely written, signed, and dated by the testator.
Magic word being handwritten.
Handwritten, yan. So,
Alam mo, Atty. Ramon, una ko narinig yan sa law school. Sabi ko, hologram. Ano yan? Isasaksak mo pa, di ba? Di ba may lalabas na ano?
yung pala handwritten lang pala, no?
Handwritten.
Yeah.
Oo.
So those are the two kinds, and they're both valid wills that we use in the Philippines. Okay, so now that we've had some basics, let's talk about context, because context is everything. So what's happening here with Emily? So Emily's father died. He left some properties behind, but more importantly, they found a will in some of his possessions. So now the question is, what are they gonna do with this? Can they just now go to the proper government office and say, "Oh, this is my dad's will.
Palipat po.
Palipat na po yung mga property sa pangalan namin." Ganun po ba yun? Or should they go to that lawyer that you mentioned earlier, Attorney Erwin? O,
Yung may
attorney,
dramatic entrance.
Oo, ito na yung will, pakibasa na sa sala namin. Pero do it on a dark rainy day. Alright. So, okay, so to answer our question, let's start with talking about the difference between testamentary succession and intestate succession. Ano naman tong klaseng succession na to? Attorney
Pinapagulo mo isip ko. Atty. Ramon.
Okay.
Paliwanag
Sige,
na yan.
hindi natin paguguluhin pa, no? So, there are two kinds of succession as well. There is what you call testamentary succession and intestate succession. In testamentary succession, this is the kind of succession that we follow when there is a will involved. Okay? So, guys, unfortunately, for all you movie lovers out there, this is not how wills work, yung babasahin sa sala. Well, at least not in the Philippines, no? Well, someday I'd love for us to do something like that, no? And actually we can, because we're executors for one of our clients, no? So we can do that. We'll try to make it happen. But for now, so like I said, if there's a will, then we call that testamentary succession, or we sometimes testate succession, no? But I prefer testamentary. So if there is a will, we use the rules under the civil code for testamentary succession.
So may rules.
May rules
na
siya,
dapat
okay?
sundin,
And
okay.
we will find those rules in the civil code. Okay? Now contrast this to intestate succession, which means, ano tingin mo, Attorney Erwin?
So yung kanina, may will.
Yes.
Malamang ito, walang will.
Walang will.
Yeah.
Tama ka dyan, Attorney Erwin. So, if you hear intestate succession, it just means there's no will involved. Okay?
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
It's not one is better than the other. Iba-iba po kasi ng situations. And
Yes.
for most people, having no will suits them just fine.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Right. No. So if there is no will, then we follow intestate succession. That means we follow the rules in the civil code pertaining to intestate succession.
Mhm.
Okay? So may rules din siya. Now we won't go into all those rules because that it takes a semester for us to learn it. In fact, the semester kulang pa yun. We had to learn all of these as we became lawyers. Okay, so that's intestate succession. So what's the difference? In testamentary succession, this usually involves the courts.
Mhm.
Okay, and in terms of procedure, this is what we call judicial settlement. Okay, so just remember, there's judicial naman and
Extrajudicial.
extrajudicial settlement of estates. And how is that? Usually for wills, if a will is involved or testamentary succession, that's where you will always have judicial settlements. In intestate succession, you can have either judicial or extrajudicial.
Mhm.
Now we have an article on that, the difference between judicial and extrajudicial. Please go to www.legalguide.ph and check it out. Right? So na-clarify na natin, judicial in court, extrajudicial judicial out of court.
Yes.
Okay? Now, in a will, if there is a will, there is a requirement in our laws, no? In terms of procedure. And what is that very, very important requirement, Attorney Erwin?
If there's a will, there has to be probate.
Yun.
Yun. So,
Natutunan-
napasok na rin natin.
Yeah,
ano?
no, natutunan namin yan sa aming professor ng law school. No? If there is a will, there has to be probate. No? So what is probate? And probate is a court process that authenticates the will. No? So now why do we need to authenticate, Attorney Erwin?
Well, there is a lot hanging
Mhm.
or relying on the will. Isipin mo yung isang pamana pupunta sa isang tao, yung isa pupunta sa kabila. So we have to make sure na talagang totoo tong will na to,
Yes.
na tama.
Right. So we need to prove to the court, no? And the court has to be convinced that the will actually belongs to our testator,
Mhm.
decedent. And of course that the testator intended that this document to be their will. And yan yung instructions nila talaga.
Could you imagine the implications? Ano kung merong sino-sino lang na nagsulat ng will,
Right.
tapos gusto mo ikaw yung pagbigyan ng lupa dito sa ano?
It's
Diba?
scary. It's scary,
It
no?
is.
So and
Kaya tinaas yung standards of evidence required for wills.
yeah, that you actually need a third person to determine kung talaga bang was this validly, ginawa ba to validly.
Mhm.
Okay? Also, in probate proceedings, aside from what we call the allowance of the will, no? So we're chine-check kung talaga bang sa testator yan and did he have the capacity and consent to do it. Eventually, in the probate proceedings, that is also where properties may be allowed to be distributed according to the will.
Mhm.
Yan. Okay. Now, ano ba legal basis ng probate, Attorney Erwin?
Okay, tatanong natin kay Atty. Basa.
Attorney Basa. So, Attorney Basa, let's go. Article 838 of the Civil Code says that no will shall pass either real or personal property unless it is proved and allowed in accordance with the rules of court. Yan.
Atty. Basa, ano naman po yung nasa rules of court?
Okay, so punta naman tayo sa rules of court. Rule 75, Section 1. No will shall pass either real or personal estate unless it is proved and allowed in the proper court. Subject to the right of appeal, such allowance of the will shall be conclusive as to its due execution.
Sobrang linaw.
Sobrang linaw, no? So, yeah, no? So, so the civil code says that it's required, the probate is required, and even the rules of court says it's required. No?
Yun lang ang sinasabi ko. Okay.
So, required ang ating probate, no?
Kahit saan ka tumingin.
Hindi pwedeng walang probate, no? Okay. Now, in terms of allowing or allowance of the will, what does the court look like? Look for. What does the court look for in a probate?
Kasi para
proceeding?
masabi na tama itong will na to.
Yes.
Solid.
Oo.
Pwedeng we can rely on the will that
Yes.
it reflects what the testator really wanted.
Yes,
Yan.
correct. So, of course, the court will look at was the will duly executed.
Okay.
Okay? Meaning, at the time of the execution, was he of sound mind?
Mhm.
Diba? And was he they want to make sure na he wasn't acting under any duress or undue influence or niloko pa siya.
Kinukurot pala. Pirma mo.
Actually,
Diba?
no, so once the court is able to see na okay, this was duly executed and the form used by or required by law was followed. Yes, okay. There was no he was of sound mind and there's no nothing bad going on in terms of the testator giving his consent, then the court will now issue a certificate of allowance.
Parang lumalabas sa akin, Attorney Ramon, tinitingnan whether the testator had the capacity as
Mhm.
well as whether it was executed voluntarily.
Yes,
Yan.
exactly. And that he was aware of
Mhm.
what he's doing. Diba? Yan. So, so related to that, let's look at ano ba yung mga grounds ng court for disallowing a will.
Mali ang will.
Oo, or hindi namin i-allow yan. Mukhang
Oo.
there's something fishy going on.
Ah,
Okay, so the first ground, and we can find this in the rules of court, okay? So the first ground is that it was not executed or attested as required by law.
So it
this
deals with the form.
it deals with the form.
Okay.
Okay, so mali yung form na ginamit nyo, mali yung procedures that you did in order to create that that will.
Mhm.
Yan. And usually we see this a lot in notarial wills, okay? Because the form required for notarial wills is very specific, and we really need to follow that. Okay. So another ground for disallowing a will is that the testator was insane or mentally incapable to make a will at the time of its execution.
So medyo capacity yung tinatamaan.
Yes, which makes sense, 'di ba? Kung loko-loko na yung or insane na yung yung testator, parang he was not able to give proper consent.
And
Diba?
it's unfair.
Unfair.
Unfair to implement that.
So please also note that it's at the time of the execution of the will. So like let's say for di ba, pretty typical for our elderly na as their age advances, sometimes they get Alzheimer's or they're not iba na yung mental functions, di ba? Their only requirement is that they were not insane when they executed. Okay? Not when they died. Okay. Third, the will, ito na, the will was executed under duress or under the influence of fear or threats. So siguro naman pag nakita ng court na may ganyan, don't allow the will. Ito favorite ko, Attorney Erwin. Will was procured under undue or improper pressure from the beneficiary. or
Ano ba ang kwento mo dyan? Mukhang may kwento ka
hindi
dyan.
naman, isipin mo, di ba? Parang gawa ka ng will, dapat ako yung makakakuha ng lahat.
Oo.
Diba?
Sino nagluluto ng pagkain mo?
Yan.
Sino naghuhugas ng ano mo?
Diba?
Diba?
Ako nag-aalaga sa'yo. Bigyan mo ko yan. No?
Okay.
No, again, it could be anyone, not just a caregiver, but diba, if there is undue influence or improper pressure by the beneficiary of the will, yan, madidisallow yan. Ayaw ng law yan. Okay? And last ground is that the signature of the testator was procured by fraud or trick, in that hindi niya inintend na yung pinipirmahan niya is going to be his will.
Ay, may alam akong ganyan.
Paano?
Pipirmahan mo to.
Ang iniisip ko nga, merong paper, pero sa ilalim, nandun yung signature.
Dumating na yung delivery mo.
Pirma mo dyan. Pero sa ilalim, will pala. No, so that was what was going on in my mind when I first read this. No,
pero if that happens, it can be a ground for
yes,
disallowance.
because the signature of the testator was procured by fraud or trickery. Okay, now, attorney, what happens if the law or the court disallows the will or says, one of these or all of these grounds na sinabi mo, andyan lahat yan. We're not going to allow the will.
So ano na mangyayari dun sa estate?
Yeah, and may will siya. Sayang.
Ano na?
Ano na?
Ang tingin ko, mag-a-apply yung second set of rules.
Ano yung second set?
As if walang will.
As if walang
Intestate.
Intestate. Yeah, which in our workshop we call it our default rules for succession. Yan. So tama ka, Attorney Erwin. If the will is found to be invalid or is not allowed, then we default to intestate succession. Yan.
Na, Attorney Ramon, actually, may tanong ako. Ito, medyo genius level itong mga...
Okay. Sige.
So, you mentioned that when the will is undergoing probate, ang tinitignan ng court is due execution.
Correct.
Tama ba? May capacity ka ba? Kinakausap ko na rin ng court si testator. May capacity ba to? Alam ba niya yung ginagawa niya? Naiintindihan ba niya? Di ba? Kaya lang ang problem sa probate, usually, di ba? Kapag nag-pass na yung testator, patay na sino pa tatanungin mo?
And that's why mataas yung level ng evidence na kailangan or yung requirements.
So, ito yung genius idea ko. What if si testator, gusto talaga niyang matuloy yung gusto niyang mangyari dun sa will? So, siya, bago pa siya mamatay, pinresinta niya yung sarili niya sa court. O court, eto ko, pwede ba tayo mag-advance probate para lahat ng gusto niyong itanong sa akin, eto ko, I can answer.
Hindi pa namamatay, advance probate?
Pwede kaya yung gano'n?
That's a good question, and that is a genius idea.
Mhm.
And the law allows that, actually. No? So,
Yun.
pwede yan. The Civil Code and the Rules of Court allow for a testator to have his will undergo probate already while he is still alive.
Testigo siya.
Yeah.
Oo, diba?
Okay. And the chances of it being being challenged are much less, diba? Or found invalid or whatever. It's much less pag the testator has it probated during his lifetime. So yes, Attorney Erwin, very good. That is a great idea, and the law allows that. Okay? So now, ito na. The court allows the will. Okay, good job. You did everything right, and we are convinced that this is a valid will. What do we do now? Okay, what the court does is they will issue a certificate of allowance. Okay, after that they will also issue yung letters testamentary to the executor. Now the executor is the person who is usually identified in the will, and siya yung taga-implement ng mga gustong mangyari ng testator. Okay? So, i-issuean din siya ng parang authority by the court through letters testamentary. And then what happens in general, now the executor will administer the estate. What does that mean? The executor will pay all the things that need to be paid. Okay? All the obligations, give support to the family, and maintain the status quo for certain businesses, ganyan. And even pay taxes. Diba? Very important. Pay your estate tax. Yeah, so the executor will do all that. And then, pag may natira, that is what will be distributed to the heirs, devisees, and possibly yung legatees.
Mhm.
Okay? So, Attorney Erwin, would you like to do a recap?
Of course, we actually covered a lot, so I think a recap would be very good at this point. So first thing we talked about is what is the difference between testamentary and intestate succession. So pinagkaiba, di ba? Testamentary may will, intestate walang will. And then meron din tayong pinag-usapan na judicial and extrajudicial. Judicial meaning dadaan ka ng korte. Extrajudicial, sa labas ka ng korte.
Labas.
Yan.
Okay, tama.
Now, next, we talked about probate, and we talked about it as a court procedure wherein the court verifies the due execution of the will. Yan. Sinisigurado lang na tama ba na yung testator naintindihan and he was capacitated to do the will at the time. Next is, what happens when the will is found invalid? Oh, hindi naman ibig sabihin na wala na makakakuha. So, kung hindi masusunod yung will, we now follow the second set of rules, which is the intestate rules.
Right.
Yung as if walang will. And then finally, we talked about the general process after probate. So, a certificate of allowance is issued, and then eventually, the executor does the job of administering and distributing the assets to the rightful recipients.
For most of you, this video was more than enough. And if it makes your life easier, then you're welcome. But there are some of you who will watch this video and end up asking more questions, such as, Attorney, how do we settle the estate if there is no will? Or, Attorney, what if the people mentioned in the will are from a second family? Or, Attorney, how do we make sure that the sharing in the will is legal? Now, if that's you, then we invite you to check out the Estate Settlement Guide workshop, where in as little as an hour, we give you a crash course on succession law, and a general law roadmap of the entire estate settlement framework. With this guide, you will know exactly where you are in the process, regardless of whether you are doing it on your own or if you have hired someone to assist you. You can access this workshop at info.legalguide.ph/estate today.
Now, to add to that, if you want us to tackle your question in our show, as we did for our reader, go to legalguide.ph and click the Submit Topic button. Next, we'd like to know what's your biggest takeaway from today's video. So please write it down in the comments and let's talk about it. Last, if you feel we've earned a good rating, please give us a like and subscribe because it gives us feedback that we're doing a good job and it encourages us to do more videos.
Now, one last thing, guys. A will is a fantastic way to leave a legacy to your loved ones. It leaves little doubt as to your intentions of how you want to care for them when you pass on.
and it prevents arguments and even misunderstandings. At the very least, it can serve as a final opportunity for us to communicate to them. So like in a love letter. And the law has given us a way to plan ahead for your future and the future of your loved ones. Let's make the most of it. So wasn't that simple? Now go make better choices.